The music stopped for one heartbeat, and every eye in the ballroom turned toward Elinor Hartley. She stood near the tall windows, her blue gown catching the candlelight, her chin lifted despite the sudden silence pressing against her chest. Charles Bennet stood a few feet away, a glass of wine in his hand, a cruel smile forming on his lips. He had just said something loud enough for the entire room to hear, something about her dress being borrowed, her manners being unpolished, her presence at the ball being a mistake that someone clearly forgot to correct. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not everyone laughed, but enough did, enough to make heat rush into Elinor's face, enough to make her hands tremble slightly at her sides. She did not cry. She refused to give him that. Instead, she looked at him directly, holding his gaze for 3 long seconds, long enough that his smile faltered just slightly, though he covered it quickly with another sip of wine. Then she turned, walked past the stunned guests, past the string quartet that had resumed playing too quickly to cover the awkward silence, and out through the grand double doors into the cool night air. Her friend Lucy Grant found her minutes later, standing beside the long driveway, arms wrapped around herself though the night was not particularly cold. "Elinor," Lucy said softly, coming to stand beside her, "don't listen to him. Everyone knows Charles Bennet says cruel things when he has had too much wine." Everyone laughed, Lucy. "Not everyone. Enough of them." Elinor's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something sharper than sadness. "Enough of them laughed that it will be the only thing anyone remembers about tonight." Lucy did not know what to say to that, so she simply stood beside her friend in silence, watching the lights of the Bennet estate glow behind them, hearing faint music drifting from windows they had just left. Elinor had grown up nothing like the people inside that house. Her family had once held land, generations back, land that had slipped away through bad decisions and worse luck. She had grown up hearing stories of what her family used to have, watching her mother's hands work themselves raw to keep what little remained. She had learned early that respect was rarely given freely to people like her. It had to be built, brick by brick, decision by decision, and even then, people like Charles Bennet could tear it down with a single sentence spoken in front of the right audience. She thought of her mother's voice, calm and patient, telling her as a child that the world would sometimes try to make her feel small, and that the measure of a person was not how loudly they responded to cruelty, but how carefully they built themselves up afterward. "I'm taking you home," Lucy said finally, touching her friend's arm. Elinor nodded, though her mind was already elsewhere, turning over what had happened, examining it from every angle the way she examined a difficult decision at work. She was not the frightened young woman Charles Bennet assumed her to be. She ran a small but growing property investment company, one she had built quietly over the past 6 years, working long hours that no one at that party would have guessed at, given how little she spoke of her business in social settings. She had learned that men like Charles rarely respected quiet success. They respected loud displays, titles, land, and the visible trappings of wealth. The car ride home was mostly silent. Lucy glanced over occasionally, worried, but Elinor stared out the window at the passing hedgerows and dark fields, her expression unreadable. "He's always been like this," Lucy said eventually. "Charles, I mean, even at school. He used to mock anyone who wasn't from the right family. I don't know why his mother invited half the county tonight if she knew he'd behave this way." "Maybe she didn't expect him to embarrass her guests," Elinor said quietly. "Or maybe she did and simply didn't care enough to stop him. Margaret Bennet cares about appearances more than almost anyone I know." Elinor allowed herself a small, humorless smile. Then perhaps tonight cost her more than she realizes. Lucy glanced at her, curious about the tone in her friend's voice, but said nothing further. She had known Elinor long enough to recognize when her friend was thinking rather than feeling, calculating rather than mourning, and she knew from experience that it was often better to let Elinor's mind work in silence than to interrupt it with questions. When they reached Elinor's small cottage on the edge of town, Lucy walked her to the door. "Will you be all right?" Lucy asked. "I will be more than all right," Elinor said, and there was something in her voice that made Lucy pause before saying goodnight. Inside, Alina did not go straight to bed. She hung her coat by the door, kicked off her shoes, and sat down at the small desk in her study, the one covered in property listings, spreadsheets, and folders of documents relating to land she had purchased over the past several years. Quietly, carefully, without ever telling anyone in town the full extent of what she owned. She opened her laptop and stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a search into the property records database she subscribed to for her work. She was not entirely sure what she was looking for yet, only that something Charles Bennett had said kept circling in her mind, something about her not belonging in that house, in that world, among those people. She thought about the Bennett estate itself, the grand house she had just left, surrounded by acres of manicured grounds. She had heard in passing conversations over the years that the estate bordered another property, a smaller but still substantial estate that had been owned by an elderly widow named Constance Farrow. Alina had met Constance once years ago at a charity function, and had found her to be sharp-witted and kind, entirely unlike the Bennetts despite living beside them for decades. She typed Constance Farrow's name into the property database, more out of curiosity than anything else, and what she found made her sit up straighter in her chair. Constance Farrow had passed away 8 months earlier. Her estate, a property called Ashgrove Hall, had been sitting in probate since then, tied up in legal matters between distant relatives who could not agree on what to do with it. According to the notes attached to the listing, an auction was expected to be announced within the next few weeks, once the legal disputes were finally resolved. Alina stared at the screen for a long time. Ashgrove Hall sat directly beside the Bennett estate. She had seen the two properties from the road many times, their grounds separated only by a low stone wall and a line of ancient oak trees. If she was remembering correctly, based on the maps she had reviewed for other clients over the years, Ashgrove Hall's main house sat close enough to the property line that its windows would look directly across at the Bennett family's east wing. She closed her laptop slowly, her mind working through the possibilities, though she forced herself not to get ahead of things. An auction announcement was not a guarantee of anything. She would need capital, legal advice, and careful timing if she wanted any real chance at securing the property before other, wealthier buyers became interested. But something about the idea settled into her chest and refused to leave. She thought again of Charles Bennett's voice, of the laughter that had followed his words, of the way the entire room had turned to look at her, as though she were an intruder in a place she had every right to attend. She thought of her mother's hands, worn from years of labor, and the stories of land that had once belonged to her family before it slipped away through circumstances no one could have controlled. She was not the same woman who had walked into that ballroom hours earlier. Something in her had shifted, quietly but permanently, the way a foundation shifts before anyone notices the cracks appearing in the walls above it. The next morning, Alina woke early, despite having gone to bed well past midnight. She made coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and opened her laptop again, this time with a clearer head and a more focused plan forming in her mind. She began making a list, the way she always did when facing a difficult challenge, breaking the impossible into smaller, more manageable pieces. First, she needed more information about the Ashgrove Hall probate situation. Second, she needed to understand her own financial position clearly, including what she could reasonably commit to a purchase of that size without endangering her existing business. Third, she needed legal counsel who understood estate auctions and could move quickly once the property was formally listed. She thought of Daniel Cole, a solicitor she had worked with on 2 previous property deals, a careful, precise man who had never once made her feel like her modest beginnings were a mark against her. She decided she would call him that morning, as soon as his office opened. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed with a message from Lucy. "Everyone's talking about last night. I'm sorry, Alina. People can be cruel." Alina looked at the message for a moment before typing back. "Let them talk. I have work to do." She set the phone down and returned her attention to the property records on her screen. A small, private smile forming on her lips for the first time since she had walked out of that ballroom. She thought of the low stone wall separating the two estates, of the ancient oak trees that would soon, perhaps, belong to her rather than to strangers she would never meet. She thought of Charles Bennet standing at his window one morning, looking out across his family's grounds, and seeing her standing on the other side of that wall, not as a guest who did not belong, but as a neighbor who very much did. The thought carried her through the rest of the morning, steady and quiet, like a decision already made, waiting only for the world to catch up with it. By midday, she had called Daniel Cole's office and secured a meeting for the following afternoon. She had also begun reviewing her own finances more carefully than she had in years, pulling together records of her savings, her business accounts, and the modest inheritance she had received from her grandmother years earlier, money she had never touched, preferring instead to let it sit and grow while she built her business from nothing. It would not be enough on its own, not for a property the size of Ashgrove Hall, but it was a start, and starts were something Eleanor understood better than most. She had built an entire company from a start no larger than this one. She spent the afternoon driving out toward Ashgrove Hall itself, parking on the quiet lane that ran along its edge, and walking slowly along the low stone wall that separated the property from the Bennet estate next door. The house itself was visible through the trees, tall windows catching the afternoon light, ivy climbing along one side of the stone facade. It was smaller than the Bennet estate, but not by much, and there was something about its quiet, dignified presence that appealed to her far more than the loud grandeur of the house she had left the night before. She stood there for a long while, listening to birds calling in the oak trees above her, feeling the cool stone of the wall beneath her palm, and imagining, just for a moment, what it might feel like to stand on this side of the wall and know that it belonged to her. A car passed slowly on the lane behind her, and she turned briefly, catching sight of Margaret Bennet's driver behind the wheel of the family's familiar dark sedan, likely running errands for the household. The car did not stop, and Eleanor was fairly certain no one inside had recognized her, but the sight of it was enough to remind her exactly why she had come to stand at this wall in the first place. She walked back to her car as the sun began to lower in the sky, her mind already turning toward the meeting with Daniel Cole the next day, toward the calls she would need to make, the numbers she would need to review, the plan that was forming more clearly with every hour that passed. Charles Bennet had wanted to remind her, in front of an entire room of people, that she did not belong among them. He had wanted to make her feel small, insignificant, easily dismissed. Instead, without meaning to, he had given her a reason to look more closely at the world he lived in, to notice the cracks and opportunities within it that he had never bothered to consider. She did not know yet whether she would succeed in acquiring Ashgrove Hall. She did not know yet what obstacles waited ahead, what other buyers might emerge, what legal complications might arise from the ongoing probate dispute. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep and quiet in her chest, that she was going to try, and that trying, for Eleanor Hartley, had always been enough to get her further than most people expected. As she drove home that evening, the stone wall and ancient oaks fading in her rearview mirror, she allowed herself finally to smile. Daniel Cole's office sat above a small bakery on the high street, two narrow rooms filled with filing cabinets and the smell of old paper. Eleanor arrived 10 minutes early, a folder of documents tucked under her arm, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression calm in a way that hid the nervous energy running underneath it. Daniel looked up from his desk when she entered, offering a warm smile. He was a tall man in his 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed very little. "Eleanor," he said, rising to shake her hand. "Sit down, you sounded serious on the phone." "I am serious." She sat across from him, placing the folder on his desk. "I want to talk about Ashgrove Hall." Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "The Farrow estate, that's an interesting choice." "You know it." "I know of it, everyone in this business does. Constance Farrow was a client of a colleague of mine years ago. The family has been fighting over her estate since she passed. Her nephew wants to sell quickly. Her niece wants to hold out for a higher price. It's been a mess." He leaned back in his chair. "What's your interest?" Elinor hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. "I want to buy it." Daniel studied her for a long moment, the way he always did when a client said something that required careful consideration. "That's a large property, Elinor, larger than anything you've purchased before. Do you have the capital?" "Not entirely, not yet, but I have more than people would guess, and I can raise the rest if the timing works in my favor." She opened her folder and slid a printed sheet across the desk toward him. "I need to know when the probate dispute will resolve and when the auction will be announced. I need to be ready to move the moment it opens." Daniel looked over the sheet, then back at her. "Can I ask why this particular property? There are other estates on the market, some with fewer complications." Elinor considered how much to say. She had not told anyone about the ball yet, not even Daniel, though she suspected word had already reached most corners of the county by now. She decided the truth, at least part of it, would serve her better than a vague answer. "It borders the Bennett estate," she said simply. Understanding crossed Daniel's face slowly, though he was too professional to ask further questions about her reasons. "I see. Can you help me, Daniel?" He was quiet for a moment, tapping his pen against the desk, running through the legal landscape in his mind the way she had seen him do many times before on other deals. "I can find out where the probate stands. I have contacts who can tell me more than what's in the public records. But Elinor, I want to be honest with you. If this property comes to auction, you won't be the only interested buyer. A place like Ashgrove Hall, bordering land like the Bennett estate, will attract attention from people with far deeper pockets than yours." "I'm aware of that." "Then you understand you may lose it, no matter how well prepared you are." Elinor met his eyes steadily. "I understand that, but I also understand that most of those buyers will be looking at it purely as an investment. They won't understand the property the way I already do, or move as quickly once the opportunity opens. I intend to have every piece of the process ready before anyone else even realizes the auction is coming." Daniel smiled slightly, the smile of a man who respected determination when he saw it clearly in front of him. "All right. Let me make some calls. Give me a few days." Elinor left his office feeling lighter than she had in days, though she knew the real work was only beginning. She spent the rest of the week reviewing her business accounts with an intensity she usually reserved for major client decisions, moving money between accounts, speaking quietly with her bank about the possibility of a substantial loan against her existing property holdings, and reaching out to a small circle of trusted investors who had worked with her before and knew her reputation for careful, profitable decisions. Word of what had happened at the ball had, as she suspected, spread through the town. She noticed it in the way people looked at her when she walked into the bakery for her morning coffee, the way conversations sometimes paused slightly when she entered a shop. Most people were kind about it, offering sympathetic words or simply pretending nothing unusual had happened. But she caught whispers here and there, comments about the Bennett family's arrogance, and once, uncomfortably, a comment suggesting she should have known better than to attend a party meant for people of a different social standing. She refused to let any of it slow her down. Lucy visited her one evening that week, arriving with a bottle of wine and a look of concern on her face. "You've barely answered my messages," Lucy said, settling onto the sofa in Elinor's small sitting room. "I was starting to worry." "I've been busy," Elinor said, pouring 2 glasses of wine and joining her friend. "Busy with what?" Elinor considered how much to share. She trusted Lucy completely, had known her since they were girls together, long before either of them had built the lives they now lived. But she also knew that once she said the words aloud, there would be no taking them back, no quiet retreat if things did not go according to plan. "I'm going to buy Ashgrove Hall," she said finally. Lucy's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. "The Farrow estate, Elinor, that's enormous. That's not a small investment property. That's an entire estate." "I know. Do you have that kind of money?" "I will once I arrange the financing properly. I've spoken with my bank. I have savings, my grandmother's inheritance, and equity from 3 properties I already own outright. It's ambitious, but it's not impossible." Lucy stared at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, a smile began to spread across her face. "It borders the Bennett estate." "It does." "Eleanor Hartley," Lucy laughed, shaking her head in disbelief. "You are absolutely serious." "I have never been more serious about anything." Lucy raised her glass. "Then I am absolutely with you. Whatever you need, tell me, and I'll help however I can." Over the following days, Eleanor found herself thinking less about the humiliation of that night and more about the challenge ahead of her, though the memory of Charles Bennett's laughing face never entirely left her mind. It served, she found, as fuel rather than wound, a quiet reminder each morning of exactly why this mattered so much to her. She thought often, too, of her mother, who had passed 3 years earlier, and of the stories she used to tell about the land their family had once owned, generations back, before a series of poor decisions and difficult years had stripped it away piece by piece. Her mother had never spoken of those losses with bitterness, only with a quiet, steady resolve that Eleanor had absorbed without fully realizing it until much later in her life. "Build something," her mother used to say. "Build it carefully, and build it so well that no one can take it from you the way they took ours." Eleanor had built her property company with exactly that philosophy in mind, starting with a single small rental property purchased with money saved from years of careful budgeting, reinvesting every profit rather than spending it, expanding slowly but steadily, until she owned a modest but genuinely impressive portfolio that few people in town realized the true scope of. She had always preferred it that way, keeping her success quiet, letting her work speak through results rather than displays. But Charles Bennett's cruelty at the ball had changed something in her calculations. For years, she had been content to build quietly, without needing recognition from people like the Bennetts. Now, for the first time, she felt a genuine desire to be seen, not for the sake of vanity, but because she wanted Charles Bennett, specifically, to understand exactly who he had mocked in front of that room full of people. Daniel Cole called her 4 days after their meeting, his voice carrying a note of urgency she had not heard from him before. "Eleanor, I need you to come to the office, now if you can." She arrived within the hour, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit as she climbed the narrow stairs to his office. "What is it?" she asked, barely through the door. Daniel gestured for her to sit, a stack of papers spread across his desk. "The probate dispute settled yesterday, quietly without much public notice yet. The Farrow family agreed to sell through a private auction rather than a public one, which means fewer people will know about it in advance, but it also means the process will move quickly. The auction is scheduled for 3 weeks from now." Eleanor's pulse quickened. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, which means you need to have your financing fully secured within the next 10 days, because the auction house will require proof of funds before allowing any bidder to participate. He slid a document across the desk toward her. "This is the estimated reserve price, based on the property's size, condition, and location. I want you to look at this number very carefully before you decide whether to move forward." Eleanor looked at the figure, and for a moment her confidence wavered. It was higher than she had expected, high enough that it would stretch her finances to their absolute limit, leaving almost no safety margin if anything went wrong. "It's a lot," she admitted quietly. "It is, and remember, this is only the reserve. If another serious bidder becomes interested, the final price could climb well beyond this number." Daniel watched her carefully. "I'm not trying to discourage you, Eleanor. I'm trying to make sure you understand exactly what you're stepping into before you commit yourself fully." Eleanor sat with the number for a long moment, turning the risk over in her mind the way she always did before making a major decision. She thought of her business, built slowly and carefully over 6 years, and the very real possibility that pursuing this purchase could threaten everything she had worked to build if the numbers did not work out in her favor. She thought, too, of the ballroom, of the laughter, of Charles Bennett's smile, as he humiliated her in front of people who had never once bothered to learn her name properly before that night. I'm doing it, she said finally, her voice steady. Help me put the financing together. Daniel nodded slowly, a hint of respect visible in his expression. All right, let's get to work. The following days passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and careful negotiation. Alina met with her bank twice, presenting a detailed business case for the loan she needed, backed by the strength of her existing property portfolio and years of consistent income. She reached out to 2 investors who had worked with her on previous projects, both of whom agreed, after careful review, to contribute smaller amounts in exchange for a modest stake in the property's eventual value. An arrangement Daniel helped her structure carefully to protect her long-term control of the estate. She barely slept during those 2 weeks, spending her days managing her existing business and her evenings poring over financial documents at her kitchen table, a pot of tea growing cold beside her more nights than not. Lucy checked in regularly, sometimes bringing dinner when she suspected Alina had forgotten to eat, sitting with her quietly while she worked rather than interrupting with unnecessary conversation. Word inevitably began to spread that someone was preparing to bid on Ashgrove Hall. Alina heard whispers of it even before Daniel confirmed that other serious buyers had registered interest, including, troublingly, a well-known property investor from the city named Victor Lang, a man known throughout the region for aggressive bidding and a habit of acquiring historic estates simply to strip them for their land value before reselling the pieces separately. If Lang wins this auction, Daniel warned her during one of their meetings, there's a real chance the estate gets subdivided, the old house potentially demolished for new development. He doesn't care about preserving these properties. He cares about profit margins. The thought of Ashgrove Hall, with its ivy-covered stone walls and centuries of quiet history, being torn apart for profit settled uneasily in Alina's chest, adding a new layer of urgency to her preparations. This was no longer only about proving something to Charles Bennett. It had become, somewhere along the way, about protecting something worth protecting. 10 days after her meeting with Daniel, her financing was finally secured, every document signed, every account verified, every piece of the puzzle locked carefully into place. She sat at her kitchen table that evening, staring at the confirmation letter from her bank, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and quiet exhilaration. She was ready. The auction was 11 days away, and for the first time since the night of the ball, Alina allowed herself to imagine, in detail, exactly what it would feel like to stand on the grounds of Ashgrove Hall as its rightful owner, looking across the low stone wall at the Bennett estate beyond it, knowing that whatever Charles Bennett thought of her, he would never again be able to pretend she did not belong. She closed her laptop, finished her cold tea in one long swallow, and allowed herself, finally, a full night's rest, knowing that the harder part of the fight was still ahead of her, waiting patiently on the other side of 11 quiet, uncertain days. The 11 days before the auction passed slower than any Alina could remember. She kept herself busy with her regular business, managing tenants, reviewing contracts, meeting with clients, but every task felt like background noise beneath the constant hum of anticipation running through her mind. Daniel called her twice during that stretch with updates, each one carrying a note of caution beneath the information he shared. Victor Lang had confirmed his registration for the auction, along with 2 other bidders Daniel described as smaller regional developers unlikely to compete seriously against someone with Lang's resources. The real contest, Daniel warned her, would come down to a battle between her and Lang was not a man accustomed to losing. He's already made inquiries about zoning changes on the property, Daniel told her during their second call. That confirms what I suspected. He's planning to subdivide if he wins. Then I can't let him win, Alina said simply. I know you're determined, Alina, but I need you to be realistic about your ceiling. I've structured your financing as tightly as I can, but there's a hard limit to what you can bid before the numbers stop making sense for your business. If Lang pushes past that number, you'll need to be prepared to walk away. Alina was quiet for a long moment. I understand. But privately, she found herself hoping it would not come to that, running through her finances again and again in the evenings, searching for any additional flexibility she might have overlooked, any margin that might buy her just a little more room if the bidding grew fierce. 4 days before the auction, she drove out to Ashgrove Hall again, parking along the quiet lane and walking the perimeter of the property slowly, taking in every detail with fresh eyes. The estate agent handling the sale had arranged a final walkthrough for registered bidders, and Alina arrived early, wanting time alone with the property before the others appeared. The house itself was even more beautiful up close than she remembered from a distance, its stone facade softened by decades of climbing ivy, tall windows reflecting the pale morning light. Inside, dust covers draped over furniture in rooms that had not been properly lived in for months, though the underlying structure remained solid, well-maintained despite Constance Farrow's advancing age in her final years. Alina moved slowly through the rooms, imagining how each space might look restored and lived in again. A large study with a fireplace and tall bookshelves. A sitting room with windows overlooking the gardens. A kitchen that would need modernizing, but retained a charming, old-fashioned character in its stone floors and wooden beams. She stood for a long while in an upstairs bedroom, looking out through the window toward the low stone wall separating the property from the Bennett estate. From this angle, she could see clearly across into a section of the Bennett grounds, including what she recognized as the East Wing Terrace where guests often gathered during warmer months. Charles Bennett's bedroom, she suspected, based on the layout she vaguely remembered from stories Lucy had once shared, sat somewhere along that same wing. She allowed herself a small, private smile at the thought before continuing her walkthrough. Other bidders began arriving as she made her way back down to the ground floor, including a well-dressed man she recognized immediately from photographs Daniel had shown her. Victor Lang moved through the entrance hall with the confident, dismissive air of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, barely glancing at the architectural details that Alina had spent the last hour admiring, instead speaking loudly into his phone about acreage and development potential. He noticed her as she passed through the hall, his eyes flicking over her with brief, appraising interest before dismissing her entirely, clearly assuming she was not a serious competitor for the property. Alina said nothing, offering only a polite nod before continuing on her way, privately grateful that he had underestimated her. It was, she had learned over the years, often an advantage to be underestimated. The days leading up to the auction blurred together in a haze of final preparations. Daniel walked her through the bidding process repeatedly, making sure she understood every rule, every procedure, every strategy that might give her an edge against a more experienced buyer like Lang. Auctions like this move fast, he told her the evening before. Don't hesitate too long between bids or it can signal weakness to other bidders. But don't bid too aggressively too early either, or you'll drive the price up faster than necessary. Let Lang show his hand first if you can. Alina barely slept that night, running through scenarios in her mind, imagining every possible turn the bidding might take, preparing herself for the disappointment of losing as carefully as she prepared herself for the possibility of winning. The morning of the auction arrived cold and clear, autumn sunlight slanting through bare branches as Alina drove to the auction house in the nearby town, a converted old bank building with high ceilings and worn wooden floors. Daniel met her outside, his expression calm but alert. "Ready?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." Inside, a modest crowd had gathered, mostly professional bidders and their representatives, along with a handful of curious locals who had come simply to watch. Alina spotted Victor Lang near the front of the room, speaking confidently with an associate, radiating the same casual confidence she had noticed during the walkthrough. She took a seat toward the middle of the room, Daniel beside her, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their trembling. The auctioneer, a brisk, efficient woman with sharp eyes, called the room to order precisely on time, running through the property details before opening the bidding at a figure well below the reserve price Daniel had shown her weeks earlier. The first several bids came quickly, small increases from the two regional developers Daniel had mentioned, neither of them pushing particularly hard. Within minutes, both had dropped out, leaving the bidding at a number still comfortably within Aliner's range. Then Victor Lang raised his paddle, calling out a bid that jumped the price significantly higher, a clear signal that he intended to establish dominance early and discourage further competition. The room went quiet, several onlookers exchanging glances, clearly expecting the bidding to end there. Aliner felt Daniel's hand touch her arm lightly, a silent reminder to wait, to let the moment breathe rather than reacting immediately. She held her nerve, watching Lang's confident expression, waiting exactly as Daniel had coached her. When no other bids came within several seconds, the auctioneer began to count down, and Aliner raised her paddle. Every head in the room turned toward her. Lang's expression flickered with mild surprise, quickly replaced by dismissive amusement, as though he found her participation more curious than threatening. He raised his paddle again almost immediately, pushing the price higher still, his tone when he called out the number carrying a note of impatience, as though eager to conclude the matter quickly and move on with his day. Aliner matched him again. The bidding continued in this pattern for several minutes, the price climbing steadily higher, the room growing increasingly tense as it became clear this had become a genuine contest between the two of them, rather than the quick, predictable auction most attendees had expected. Lang's confident amusement gave way slowly to something sharper, more focused, as he seemed to finally register that Aliner had no intention of backing down. At one point, during a brief pause while the auctioneer confirmed the current figure, Lang turned in his seat to look at Aliner directly for the first time. "You understand what you're bidding on, don't you?" he said, his voice carrying just far enough for those seated nearby to hear. "This isn't a starter home, this is serious money." Aliner met his gaze evenly. "I understand exactly what I'm bidding on, Mr. Lang." Something in her calm, steady tone seemed to unsettle him more than any aggressive response could have, and he turned back toward the front of the room without further comment, though Aliner noticed his jaw tighten slightly as the auctioneer resumed the bidding. The price climbed past the reserve figure Daniel had shown her, then continued climbing beyond it, each new bid pushing Aliner closer to the absolute limit of what her financing could support. She felt her heartbeat quicken with each exchange, her palms damp against the paddle in her hand, but she forced herself to maintain the same steady, unreadable expression she had held since the bidding began. Daniel leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. "You're approaching your ceiling, Aliner. 2 more bids at most." She nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving the auctioneer. Lang raised his paddle again, calling out a number that made several people in the room murmur audibly. It was, Aliner realized with a sinking feeling, precisely at the very edge of what she had budgeted, leaving her almost no room to respond without exceeding the limit Daniel had warned her never to cross. She thought in that suspended moment of everything that had led her to this room. The ballroom, the laughter, her mother's worn hands, the years of careful, quiet work that had brought her to this exact point in her life. She thought of the low stone wall separating Ashgrove Hall from the Bennett estate, and of Charles Bennett's face the moment he would learn who had purchased the property beside his family's home. She raised her paddle one final time, calling out a number that exceeded the absolute ceiling she and Daniel had agreed upon, a number she would need to find additional financing to cover, a risk she had not fully planned for but could not bring herself to abandon in this final moment. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward Victor Lang, waiting to see whether he would respond. He sat still for a long, tense moment, his expression unreadable, clearly weighing whether the property was worth pushing the price any higher. Aliner held her breath, forcing herself to appear calm despite the pounding of her heart. Finally, Lang shook his head slightly, muttering something to his associate before setting his paddle down on the table in front of him, a small, dismissive gesture that nonetheless carried the full weight of surrender. "Going once," the auctioneer called, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Going twice." The silence stretched unbroken. Sold to the bidder in the center of the room. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd as heads turned toward Alina, several faces registering surprise, a few offering small, approving nods. Daniel exhaled beside her, a slow, relieved breath, and placed a steadying hand briefly on her shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. "Ashgrove Hall is yours." Alina sat perfectly still for a moment, letting the reality of it settle over her slowly, the weight of what she had just done pressing against her chest in a way that felt both terrifying and deeply satisfying all at once. She had exceeded her planned limit, had taken on more risk than she had originally intended, but she had won, and in this moment, that fact alone outweighed every worry crowding in behind it. As the room began to empty, Victor Lang approached her briefly on his way out, his expression a careful mixture of professional respect and lingering irritation. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but you fight harder than anyone I've bid against in years." "Alina Hartley," she said simply, extending her hand. He shook it briefly. "Well, Miss Hartley, I hope you know what you're taking on. That property needs significant investment to bring it back to its full potential." "I intend to give it exactly that," Alina replied. Lang studied her for a moment longer, something like grudging respect flickering across his features, before he nodded once and turned to leave, his associate trailing behind him. Outside, the autumn air felt sharper, cleaner than it had that morning, and Alina stood for a long moment on the steps of the auction house, letting the enormity of what had just happened wash over her. Daniel joined her a few minutes later, having stayed behind to finalize the paperwork. "The exceeding bid puts you in a tighter position than we planned," he said gently. "We'll need to arrange additional financing quickly to cover the difference and complete the purchase within the required timeline." "I know," Alina said. "We'll figure it out, we always do." Daniel smiled, shaking his head slightly. "I've worked with a lot of clients over the years, Alina. I don't think I've ever seen anyone fight for a property the way you fought for this one." Alina looked past him, out toward the horizon where, somewhere beyond the rolling hills, Ashgrove Hall now waited for her, hers at last, its ivy-covered walls standing quietly beside the estate of the man who had once tried to convince an entire room full of people that she did not belong among them. "This property matters to me more than most people would understand," she said quietly. Daniel did not press her further, simply nodding as they walked together toward their cars, the paperwork that would transform her life tucked securely under his arm. The drive home felt different than any drive she had taken before, the familiar roads and hedgerows somehow sharper, more vivid, as though the entire world had shifted slightly on its axis. She called Lucy from the car, barely able to keep the excitement from her voice as she shared the news. "Alina," Lucy's voice crackled with delighted disbelief through the phone. "You actually did it. You bought Ashgrove Hall." "I did. Charles Bennett has no idea what's coming for him, does he?" Alina smiled at the road ahead of her, the low afternoon sun catching the windshield. "No," she said. "He has absolutely no idea." That evening, alone in her small cottage, Alina sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the signed purchase document spread before her, the reality of what she had accomplished slowly settling into something solid and real. She thought of the additional financing she would need to secure in the coming days, the renovation work that would need careful planning, the countless details that would need managing before she could truly call Ashgrove Hall home. But beneath all of it, one clear, satisfying thought remained steady in her mind, quiet and unshakable. She had done it. Days after Charles Bennett stood in front of an entire room and told her, without saying the words directly, that she did not belong among people like him. She had purchased the estate next door to his family's home. Now all that remained was moving in. News in a small town travels faster than any official announcement ever could, and by the second morning after the auction, it seemed that nearly everyone within a 10-mile radius had heard some version of what had happened. Alina first noticed it when the woman behind the counter at the bakery greeted her with a wide, knowing smile instead of the usual polite nod. Well, the woman said, sliding a coffee across the counter, I heard congratulations are in order. Elinor smiled, though she kept her response modest. News travels quickly around here. Ashgrove Hall, the woman said, shaking her head in something like admiration. Right next to the Bennets, no less. My sister works for the caterer they use for their parties. She says the whole household is in an uproar. Elinor sipped her coffee, allowing herself only a small, private satisfaction at the words, careful not to appear too pleased in public. She thanked the woman and left, walking back toward her car with a lightness in her step that had nothing to do with the coffee warming her hands. The truth was, she had expected word to spread, but she had not fully anticipated just how quickly or how far. By that afternoon, Lucy called her with an update that made Elinor nearly drop the phone. Margaret Bennet is apparently furious, Lucy said, her voice carrying poorly concealed delight. My cousin does the flowers for their events, and she said Margaret has been on the phone all morning trying to figure out how this happened. Apparently she had no idea the estate was even up for sale until it was already gone. She'll find out soon enough, Elinor said, though her heart was beating a little faster at the thought of Margaret Bennet's reaction, sharp and controlled as the woman always appeared in public. And Charles, Lucy continued, unable to hide the grin in her voice, apparently found out from one of his friends at the club who heard it from someone at the auction house. My cousin says he went pale when he heard your name. Elinor allowed herself a small laugh, the first genuine laugh she had experienced in days. I would have liked to see that. Give it time, Lucy said. You'll be seeing plenty of him soon enough, being neighbors and all. The thought settled into Elinor's mind with a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy as she ended the call and turned her attention back to the enormous list of tasks now facing her. The additional financing Daniel had helped arrange came through within days, structured carefully to protect her existing business while covering the gap between her original budget and the final winning bid. It left her finances tighter than she would have liked, but manageable, provided she approached the renovation of Ashgrove Hall with careful discipline rather than unnecessary extravagance. She met with a contractor recommended by Daniel, a practical, experienced man named Peter Hollies who specialized in restoring historic properties without stripping away their original character. Together they walked through the house room by room, cataloging what needed immediate attention and what could wait, prioritizing the most essential repairs, plumbing that needed updating, wiring that needed modernizing, a roof section above the east wing that required patching before winter arrived in earnest. You've got good bones here, Peter told her, running a hand along one of the original wooden beams in the main hall. Whoever built this place knew what they were doing. It just needs someone willing to care for it properly again. That's exactly my intention, Elinor said and meant it. Over the following 2 weeks, she split her time between managing her existing business and overseeing the beginning stages of renovation at Ashgrove Hall, driving out to the property nearly every day to check on progress, to make decisions about materials and finishes, to simply stand in the quiet rooms and imagine the life that would eventually fill them. She had not yet crossed paths with any member of the Bennet family since the purchase became public knowledge, though she knew it was only a matter of time before their paths inevitably intersected, given the proximity of their 2 properties. She found herself both dreading and anticipating that first encounter, uncertain exactly how she would feel when it finally happened. The encounter came sooner than she expected. She was standing near the low stone wall one afternoon, discussing with Peter the possibility of restoring an old garden gate that had once connected a walking path along the property's edge, when she heard footsteps approaching from the other side of the wall. She looked up to see Margaret Bennet walking briskly along the boundary line, her expression carefully composed but her eyes sharp with poorly hidden curiosity. Miss Hartley, Margaret said, stopping a few feet from the wall, her voice carrying the same polished, controlled tone Elinor remembered from social gatherings over the years, though never directed at her personally before now. I heard the news, of course, but I confess I hardly believed it until I saw the renovation crew myself. Mrs. Bennet, Alina replied, keeping her own voice equally composed, though her heart beat a little faster at the unexpected encounter. "It's true. I'm delighted to be your new neighbor." Something flickered behind Margaret's eyes, quickly masked. "How wonderful. I must say, we had no idea the property was even available." Constance's family kept the whole process rather quiet. "A private auction," Alina said simply. "These things happen quickly sometimes." Margaret's gaze traveled briefly over the renovation work visible behind Alina, the scaffolding along one section of the house, the materials stacked near the entrance. "You're taking on quite a project. Ashgrove Hall hasn't seen proper investment in years." Constance, bless her, wasn't able to keep up with everything toward the end. "I intend to restore it properly," Alina said. "It deserves that." "Well," Margaret's smile tightened slightly at the corners. "I suppose we'll be seeing much more of each other going forward, given the circumstances." "I suppose we will," Alina agreed, holding the other woman's gaze steadily. There was a brief, charged silence between them, both women clearly aware of the unspoken history hanging in the air. The memory of that ballroom, of Charles's cruel words, of the laughter that had followed. Margaret did not mention it directly, and neither did Alina, but something in the careful way they regarded each other made clear that both understood exactly what lingered beneath the polite exchange. "Well," Margaret said finally, straightening slightly, "I should continue my walk. Welcome to the neighborhood, Miss Hartley." "Thank you, Mrs. Bennet." Alina watched the older woman walk away, her posture rigid, her pace slightly quicker than it had been on her approach, and felt something settle firmly into place within her chest, a quiet confirmation that she had made exactly the right decision. That evening, she recounted the exchange to Lucy over dinner at Alina's cottage, both of them sharing a bottle of wine as autumn rain pattered softly against the windows. "She actually came to see for herself," Lucy said, shaking her head in amazement. "I bet she couldn't believe it until she saw it with her own eyes." "I think that's exactly it," Alina said. "I don't think any of them believed I could actually afford it, let alone pull it off so quickly." "How did she seem? Charles's mother, I mean." Alina considered the question carefully. "Composed, controlled, but underneath it I think she was rattled. She kept looking at the renovation work like she was trying to calculate exactly how much I must have spent." Lucy laughed, let her wonder. "I intend to." Over the following days, word of Alina's purchase continued to ripple through local social circles, generating a curious mixture of reactions. Some acquaintances who had barely acknowledged her before now greeted her warmly whenever their paths crossed, an obvious, if somewhat transparent, shift in attitude now that her financial standing had become public knowledge. Others, particularly those closely aligned with the Bennet family's social circle, treated her with a newfound wariness, uncertain how to categorize a woman who had, seemingly overnight, transformed from an outsider mocked at a ball into a landowner whose estate bordered one of the most prominent families in the county. Alina found she did not particularly care which category people fell into. She had not purchased Ashgrove Hall to win social approval, though she would be lying to herself if she claimed the shift in attitude did not carry a certain satisfaction. She threw herself into the renovation with focused energy, working closely with Peter Hollis and his crew, making careful decisions about which original features to preserve and which needed modernizing. She chose to keep the old stone fireplaces, the original wooden floors throughout most of the house, the tall windows that filled every room with natural light. She approved updates to the kitchen and bathrooms, necessary modernizations that would make the house genuinely livable without stripping away its historic character. Each visit to the property deepened her connection to it, transforming it in her mind from simply a strategic acquisition into something closer to a genuine home, a place she found herself looking forward to returning to each day despite the exhaustion of managing both the renovation and her existing business simultaneously. Nearly 3 weeks after the auction, as the renovation work moved steadily toward completion on the essential repairs, Alina received an unexpected phone call from Daniel Cole. "I thought you'd want to know," he said, his tone carrying a note of amusement. "I ran into an associate of mine today who does legal work for the Bennett family. Apparently there's been some tension in that household since your purchase became public." "What kind of tension?" "From what I understand, Charles wasn't pleased to learn his family had missed the opportunity to purchase Ashgrove Hall themselves, expanding their own holdings before it fell into someone else's hands. Apparently he's been quite vocal about it at home." Elinor felt a small, satisfied smile tug at her lips. "I imagine he has." "There's more," Daniel continued. "My associate mentioned that the Bennett family has an annual gathering coming up in a few weeks, a fairly significant event they host every autumn. Apparently there's been some debate in the household about whether to extend an invitation to you, given the circumstances." Elinor considered this information carefully. "Do you think they will?" "Given how quickly gossip travels in these circles, and how it would look if they pointedly excluded their newest, most talked-about neighbor, I suspect social pressure alone may force their hand." Daniel paused. "How would you feel about that if the invitation came?" Elinor looked out through her kitchen window, toward the direction of Ashgrove Hall, imagining the low stone wall, the ancient oaks, the estate now legally and firmly hers. "I would go," she said simply. "And this time I would walk into that house not as a guest hoping to be accepted, but as a woman who belongs there every bit as much as they do." Daniel's low chuckle carried through the phone. "I suspect that's exactly why they're so nervous about it." After the call ended, Elinor sat quietly for a long while, turning the possibility over in her mind, imagining every detail of what such an evening might look like, how she would present herself, how she would carry the quiet confidence that had grown steadily within her since the night of her humiliation. She thought of Charles Bennett's face across a crowded room, no longer laughing, no longer mocking, forced instead to reckon with the reality of who she had become in the weeks since he had tried, so carelessly, to make her feel small. Whatever happened next, she felt certain of one thing: she would never again walk into a room in that county feeling as though she did not belong. 6 weeks after the auction, Elinor moved into Ashgrove Hall. The essential renovations were complete by then, the roof fully repaired, the wiring and plumbing modernized throughout, the kitchen transformed into a bright, functional space that still honored the original stone floors and wooden beams. Peter Hollies and his crew had done exceptional work, and though several cosmetic projects remained ongoing, the house was fully livable, warm, and for the first time in years, cared for properly. Elinor spent her first evening in the house sitting alone in the main study, a fire crackling in the restored fireplace, a glass of wine in hand, looking around at the space that now belonged entirely to her. The walls were lined with bookshelves she had begun filling with her own collection, carried over slowly from the cottage over the preceding weeks. A rug she had chosen carefully covered the wide wooden floorboards, and above the mantel hung a single painting, a quiet countryside scene she had purchased from a local artist, the first piece of art she had ever bought purely because it brought her joy rather than as an investment. She thought of her mother in that quiet moment, wishing, as she often did during significant milestones in her life, that she could share this achievement with her. She imagined her mother's reaction, the quiet pride that would have shone in her eyes, the gentle reminder she likely would have offered about staying grounded even in success. Lucy visited the following weekend, walking through each room with wide, delighted eyes, exclaiming over the restored details, the tall windows, the elegant simplicity of Elinor's careful design choices. "This is incredible, Elinor," Lucy said, standing in the main hall and turning slowly to take in the space. "I mean it. This feels like it was always meant to be your home." "It's strange," Elinor admitted, leading her friend toward the kitchen where tea was already steeping. "I bought this place for reasons that had almost nothing to do with actually wanting to live here, if I'm honest with myself. But now that I'm here, I can't imagine wanting to be anywhere else." "Funny how that works sometimes," Lucy said, accepting a cup of tea and settling onto a stool at the kitchen counter. "Spite gets you in the door, and then the house just quietly convinces you to stay." Elinor laughed, pouring her own cup, Something like that. They spent the afternoon together, wandering the grounds as the autumn light softened toward evening, discussing plans for the gardens, which still needed considerable work after years of neglect. Alina pointed out the low stone wall separating her property from the Bennett estate, visible from several vantage points across the grounds, including, she had discovered with quiet satisfaction, a clear line of sight from the study window where she had sat the previous evening. "Have you seen any of them yet?" Lucy asked, following Alina's gaze toward the wall. "Since you moved in properly, I mean." "Not yet. I saw Margaret briefly during the renovation, but nothing since I actually moved in." Alina paused, considering. "I imagine it's only a matter of time, though. We share that wall. Eventually our paths will cross." The encounter, when it finally came, happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, nearly a week after Alina had fully settled into the house. She had risen early, as had become her habit, and decided to walk the grounds before beginning her workday, appreciating the quiet stillness of the estate in the early morning light. Frost had settled lightly across the grass overnight, and her breath clouded faintly in the cool air as she walked along the edge of her property, following the line of the stone wall toward the old garden gate Peter's crew had recently restored. She heard footsteps on the other side of the wall before she saw him, and something in the rhythm of the steps, purposeful, unhurried, made her stomach tighten with sudden recognition even before Charles Bennett came into view. He stopped abruptly when he saw her, clearly having expected the grounds along the boundary to be empty at this early hour. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the cold morning air settling silently around them as they regarded each other across the low stone wall, the same wall that had, weeks earlier, existed only as an idea in Alina's mind, a symbol of the proximity she intended to claim. Charles looked different than she remembered from the ball, dressed casually in a heavy coat rather than formal evening wear, his expression carrying none of the confident arrogance that had colored his cruel words that night. Instead, he looked almost uncertain, caught entirely off guard by her sudden presence. "Miss Hartley," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Bennett," Alina replied, matching his tone precisely, refusing to let even a trace of the satisfaction she felt show on her face. Another silence stretched between them, longer and more uncomfortable than the first. Alina held her ground, refusing to be the one to look away first, watching as something shifted slowly across his features. Recognition, perhaps, of exactly how thoroughly the circumstances between them had changed since that night at the ball. "I heard you'd purchased the property," he said eventually, his gaze flicking briefly toward the restored garden gate behind her, the visible signs of careful renovation stretching across the grounds beyond it. "I confess, I didn't quite believe it until now." "I understand the surprise," Alina said evenly, "though I'm not entirely sure why it should have seemed so unbelievable." Something flickered across his face, and for a moment she thought she detected the faintest trace of discomfort, though he covered it quickly with a tight, polite smile. "Ashgrove Hall is a significant property. It's an impressive acquisition." "Thank you." Alina kept her voice pleasant, deliberately withholding any acknowledgement of the tension clearly running beneath the surface of their exchange. "I've enjoyed the renovation process a great deal. The house had wonderful bones underneath years of neglect." "So I've heard." Charles shifted his weight slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation, but apparently unwilling to simply walk away without some further exchange. "Look, Miss Hartley, about the ball." "There's no need," Alina cut in smoothly, her tone calm but firm, giving him no opening to offer whatever half-formed apology he might have been attempting. "That was weeks ago. I've moved on to far more interesting matters since then." She watched the words land, watched his jaw tighten slightly at the implied dismissal, the clear message beneath her polite phrasing that he and his opinion of her mattered far less to her now than perhaps he had assumed they would. "Of course," he said stiffly. "Well, I should continue my walk." "Enjoy your morning, Mr. Bennett." He nodded once curtly and turned to continue along his path, though Alina noticed his pace was quicker than before, his shoulders held with a rigid tension that had not been present when she first spotted him approaching. She watched him go for a moment before continuing her own walk in the opposite direction. A small, private smile finally allowed to surface now that he was no longer close enough to see it. She had imagined this encounter countless times over the preceding weeks, uncertain exactly how she would feel when it finally happened. She had expected anger, perhaps, or lingering hurt from the memory of that night. Instead, she found herself feeling something closer to quiet satisfaction, a sense of having successfully reclaimed something that had been taken from her that evening, though she could not have named precisely what that something was. She recounted the encounter to Lucy later that day over the phone, describing every detail with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "He tried to apologize." Lucy's voice carried clear astonishment. "Charles Bennett actually tried to apologize." "He started to. I didn't let him finish." "Good," Lucy said firmly. "Let him sit with it a while longer before he gets that satisfaction." Over the following days, Alina settled more fully into her new routine, managing her business from a newly established home office in one of the smaller rooms overlooking the gardens, continuing to oversee the final cosmetic touches of the renovation, and slowly beginning to build a genuine life within the walls of Ashgrove Hall. She hired a part-time gardener, a friendly older man named Arthur who had worked for Constance Farrow years earlier and knew the grounds intimately, helping restore the gardens to something closer to their former beauty. She crossed paths with members of the Bennett family several more times over the following 2 weeks, brief, polite exchanges that carried an entirely different tone than that first encounter with Charles. She spoke with Edward Bennett once, Charles's father, a quieter, more reserved man than his wife, who seemed genuinely, if cautiously, impressed by the care Alina had taken in restoring the historic property. "Constance would be pleased," he told her during a brief conversation near the boundary wall. "She loved this house. It's good to see it cared for properly again." "Thank you," Alina said, genuinely touched by the sentiment. "I've grown quite attached to it myself." She saw Margaret twice more, both encounters carrying the same carefully controlled politeness as their first meeting, though Alina noticed the older woman's demeanor had softened slightly, perhaps in grudging acknowledgement of the genuine effort Alina had invested in the property, or perhaps simply in recognition that Alina was, whether the family liked it or not, now a permanent fixture in their immediate surroundings. Charles remained the most difficult presence among them, and Alina found herself unconsciously tracking the rhythm of his movements around the estate, noticing when he was likely to be walking the grounds, adjusting her own schedule occasionally to avoid unnecessary encounters, though she could not have said with complete honesty whether this avoidance stemmed from lingering discomfort or from a strategic desire to maintain her advantage by controlling exactly when and how their paths crossed. 3 weeks after moving in, Alina received an invitation through the post, elegant cream-colored cardstock bearing the Bennett family's familiar embossed crest, formally inviting her to their annual autumn gathering, scheduled for the following month. She held the invitation for a long moment, running her fingers over the raised lettering, feeling the weight of everything it represented settle over her. Lucy arrived that evening, having heard the news already through her usual network of local connections, practically bursting with excitement as she settled into Alina's newly furnished sitting room. "You're going, obviously," Lucy said, not really a question. "Obviously," Alina agreed, a slow smile spreading across her face as she looked at the invitation once more before setting it carefully on the mantel above the restored fireplace, propped where she would see it every evening as the date approached. "This time, I intend to walk into that house exactly the way I should have been treated the first time. Not as someone hoping to be accepted, but as someone they can no longer afford to dismiss." Lucy raised her teacup in a small, celebratory toast. "To Ashgrove Hall," she said, "and to Alina Hartley finally getting exactly what she deserves." Alina lifted her own cup, looking out through the tall study window toward the darkening line of the stone wall in the distance, beyond which the Bennett estate sat glowing faintly with early evening lights. To what comes next, she said quietly and drank. The weeks leading up to the Bennett family's autumn gathering passed with a strange mixture of ordinary routine and quiet anticipation. Elinor continued managing her business, overseeing the last remaining details of the Ashgrove Hall renovation, and settling more deeply into the rhythms of her new life. But beneath it all, a steady awareness of the approaching evening hummed constantly in the back of her mind. She spent an afternoon with Lucy selecting her dress for the occasion, choosing deliberately this time, not for how it might be perceived by others, but for how it made her feel when she looked in the mirror. She settled on a deep emerald gown, elegant but understated, the color rich against her dark hair, entirely unlike anything she had worn to the ball months earlier. "You look like you own the room before you even walk into it," Lucy told her during the final fitting, standing back to admire the effect. "That's rather the point," Elinor said with a small smile. In the days before the gathering, she also found herself, almost without planning it, becoming more visible within the local community than she had ever been before. Word of her successful acquisition and careful restoration of Ashgrove Hall had continued to spread, and she began receiving invitations to smaller social gatherings, lunches with women who ran their own businesses in the region, a charity committee meeting organized by a woman named Grace Whitmore, who Elinor had met briefly years earlier, but never developed a closer acquaintance with until now. Grace, it turned out, was sharp, warm, and refreshingly direct, entirely unlike the carefully guarded social circles Elinor had observed from a distance for most of her adult life. Over coffee one afternoon, Grace mentioned, almost in passing, that she had heard about the incident at the ball months earlier. "I wasn't there myself," Grace said, "but I heard about it from 3 separate people within the week. Charles Bennett has always had a cruel streak, even as a boy. I'm glad to see it didn't slow you down." "It didn't," Elinor said simply. "If anything, it gave me exactly the push I needed." Grace laughed, a genuine, appreciative sound. "Well, I for one am delighted to have you as part of our little committee. We could use more women who understand how to turn a setback into an opportunity." Their conversation marked the beginning of what would become a genuine friendship, and through Grace, Elinor found herself gradually introduced to a wider circle of accomplished, capable women throughout the county, several of whom expressed open admiration for the story that had, by now, taken on something of a local legend status. The woman humiliated at a ball who had, within days, purchased the estate next door to her tormentor's family. Elinor found she did not mind the attention nearly as much as she once might have. There was something quietly satisfying about being recognized not for her humiliation, but for how thoroughly she had responded to it. The evening of the gathering arrived on a crisp autumn night, the sky clear and star-filled as Elinor's car made the short drive from Ashgrove Hall to the Bennett estate next door, a journey that would have taken barely 5 minutes to walk given the proximity of the two properties. She had considered walking, in fact, appreciating the symbolism of arriving on foot from her own land directly onto theirs, but ultimately decided against it, preferring to arrive with the same formal presentation as any other guest. The house was lit beautifully when she arrived, golden light spilling from every window, the same grand entrance she remembered from months earlier, though this time, walking through those doors felt entirely different. She handed her coat to the waiting staff and made her way into the main hall, where the party was already in full swing, string music drifting from the same quartet she recognized from the previous event. Dozens of familiar and unfamiliar faces mingling throughout the space. Conversations paused briefly as she entered, heads turning with open curiosity rather than the cruel amusement she remembered from before. Several guests approached her almost immediately, offering warm greetings, expressing admiration for what she had accomplished with Ashgrove Hall, clearly eager to align themselves with the woman who had become, in the span of a few short months, one of the more intriguing figures in local society. Grace found her within minutes, looping her arm through Elinor's with easy familiarity. "You look absolutely radiant," Grace said, "and I do believe half this room has already noticed." "Let them notice," Elinor said, allowing herself to relax slightly into the warmth of the greeting. She spotted Margaret Bennet across the room, engaged in conversation with a small cluster of guests, her expression carefully composed as always, though Alina noticed her gaze drift toward her more than once throughout the evening, tracking her movements with poorly disguised interest. It was nearly an hour before she encountered Charles directly, finding herself standing near the edge of the main hall when he approached, dressed formally in dark evening wear, his expression carrying a careful neutrality that did little to mask the tension visible in the set of his shoulders. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice pitched low enough to avoid drawing attention from those around them, "I wasn't certain you would attend." "Why wouldn't I?" Alina asked pleasantly, holding his gaze steadily. "It's a lovely party, and I do enjoy a well-hosted evening." Something flickered across his face, frustration perhaps, at her calm refusal to acknowledge the obvious tension between them. "I wanted to say, properly this time, that I regret what happened here months ago. It was thoughtless of me. I'd had too much to drink, and I said things I shouldn't have." Alina studied him for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. There was something genuine in his tone, she thought, though whether it stemmed from actual remorse or simply from the discomfort of having a wealthy, accomplished neighbor who now moved comfortably through circles he had once assumed were closed to her, she could not entirely determine. "Apology accepted," she said finally, though her tone carried a coolness that made clear the words did not erase everything that had happened since. "Though I should tell you, Mr. Bennet, that evening did me a considerable favor in the end." "How do you mean?" "It reminded me exactly what I was capable of when properly motivated." She allowed a small, deliberate smile. "I don't think I would have pursued Ashgrove Hall with quite the same determination if you hadn't given me such excellent reason to." Charles's expression shifted, something complicated passing across his features, equal parts embarrassment and reluctant admiration. "Well," he said finally, "for what it's worth, the property has never looked better. My father says the same. Please thank him for the kind words." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of another guest, and Charles excused himself with a slight, formal nod, leaving Alina alone once more with Grace, who had watched the exchange from a discreet distance with obvious curiosity. "Well," Grace asked, once he was safely out of earshot, "what did the great Charles Bennet have to say for himself?" "An apology," Alina said. "Rather overdue, but I suppose I'll take it." "Did it feel satisfying?" Alina considered the question honestly. "Not as satisfying as I expected, actually. I think I've moved so far past that evening that his apology feels almost irrelevant now. What matters far more is everything I've built since." Grace smiled warmly. "That, my dear, is exactly the right attitude." The evening continued pleasantly, Alina moving comfortably through the gathered crowd, engaging in conversations that felt entirely different from her experience months earlier. No longer an outsider hoping for acceptance, but a genuine participant in the social fabric of the community, respected for her accomplishments rather than dismissed for her origins. It was nearly midway through the evening when the first sign of trouble emerged, subtle at first, easy to miss amid the general noise of the party. Alina noticed a small cluster of guests near the refreshment table speaking in hushed, urgent tones, glancing occasionally in her direction with expressions that carried more than simple curiosity. Grace noticed it too, her brow furrowing slightly. "I wonder what that's about." They found out soon enough. A woman Alina recognized vaguely from earlier business dealings, a local investor named Fiona Marsh, approached with a carefully neutral expression that did little to hide her genuine concern. "Alina," Fiona said quietly, drawing her slightly aside from the main crowd, "I probably shouldn't say anything, but I think you should know. There's a rumor circulating tonight, something about financial irregularities connected to your purchase of Ashgrove Hall, something about the auction not being entirely above board." Alina felt a cold, sudden clarity settle over her, the pleasant warmth of the evening evaporating instantly. Where did this rumor originate? Fiona hesitated. I heard it from someone who heard it from someone else, so I can't say for certain. But given the timing, and given who benefits from casting doubt on the legitimacy of your purchase, I have my suspicions. Alina's gaze drifted across the room, finding Charles standing near the far wall, engaged in conversation with two men she did not recognize, his posture carrying a studied casualness that suddenly seemed far more deliberate than she had initially assumed. She excused herself from Fiona and Grace, moving with careful, controlled steps toward Daniel Cole, who she had noticed earlier standing near the terrace doors, having been invited as her guest for the evening. "Daniel," she said quietly, pulling him slightly aside. "I need to know if there's any possible way our financing arrangement or the auction process could be misconstrued as improper." Daniel's expression sharpened immediately at her tone. "Absolutely not. Everything was handled with complete transparency, properly documented at every stage. Why do you ask?" "There's a rumor circulating tonight suggesting otherwise." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation to spread, especially without any basis. Do you know where it originated?" "I have a suspicion," Alina said, glancing once more toward Charles, who had noticed her attention and was now watching her with an expression she could not entirely read across the crowded room. Rather than allow the rumor to fester unchecked through the remainder of the evening, Alina made a swift, deliberate decision. She approached Margaret Bennet directly, finding the older woman near the center of the main hall. "Mrs. Bennet," she said, her voice pitched carefully to carry to those standing nearby without becoming a public spectacle. "I understand there's a rumor circulating this evening regarding the legitimacy of my purchase of Ashgrove Hall. I wanted to address it directly, since it concerns my reputation, and I'd rather not let misinformation spread unchecked at your lovely event." Margaret's composed expression flickered with visible surprise at the direct approach. "I hadn't heard anything of the sort." "I have my solicitor here this evening," Alina continued smoothly, gesturing toward Daniel, who stepped forward to join her. "He can confirm in complete detail exactly how the auction and subsequent purchase were conducted, entirely above board, with full documentation available for anyone who wishes to review it. I would hate for any doubt to linger unnecessarily." Daniel offered a brief, professional summary of the transaction's legitimacy, his precise, confident delivery leaving little room for continued speculation among the small crowd that had gathered to observe the exchange. Margaret's gaze flicked briefly toward Charles across the room before returning to Alina, something sharp and knowing passing behind her carefully composed expression. "Well," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of genuine irritation, though Alina could not be entirely certain whether it was directed at her or at whoever had started the rumor in the first place. "I'm sure that puts the matter to rest entirely. Please forgive any misunderstanding, Miss Hartley." "Of course," Alina said graciously, though her eyes remained steady, watching Margaret's reaction carefully. As the small crowd dispersed, satisfied by the clear, confident resolution, Alina caught sight of Charles retreating quietly toward the terrace doors, his expression tight, his earlier casual posture entirely abandoned. Grace appeared at her side moments later, eyebrows raised in open admiration. "That," she said, "was masterfully handled. I've learned it's always better to address these things directly, rather than letting them grow in the shadows," Alina said, though her heart was still beating quickly from the tension of the confrontation. Later that evening, as the party began winding down and guests started making their departures, Alina found herself briefly alone with Charles near the entrance hall, both of them waiting for their respective transportation. "That was clever," he said quietly, not quite meeting her eyes. "Addressing it so directly, I mean." "I find it's usually the most effective approach," Alina replied, studying him carefully. "Was it you, Charles? The rumor, I mean." He was silent for a long moment, his jaw working slightly before he finally answered, his voice low and reluctant. "I may have mentioned some concerns to a few friends. I didn't intend for it to spread quite so far or so quickly." "I see." Alina kept her voice steady, though something cold settled in her chest at the confirmation. I would ask you to be more careful in the future about what concerns you choose to share with your friends regarding my business affairs. Eleanor, Miss Hartley, she corrected gently but firmly. He nodded, accepting the correction without argument, something in his expression suggesting genuine discomfort at having been caught so plainly in his own attempt at undermining her. Understood. She left the gathering shortly after, walking the short distance back toward Ashgrove Hall beneath a clear, star-filled sky, the events of the evening settling slowly into place within her mind. She had walked into that house as an equal, had been treated, for the most part, with genuine respect and curiosity rather than dismissal, and had successfully defended her reputation against an attempt to undermine it, all within the span of a single evening. Charles Bennet, she realized, was not yet finished trying to reassert whatever sense of superiority he had lost since that night at the ball. But she was no longer the woman who had walked out of that house in quiet devastation months earlier. She was someone entirely capable of standing her ground, of defending what she had built, and of ensuring that whatever came next, she would meet it with the same steady confidence that had carried her this far already. As she reached the low stone wall separating the two properties, she paused for a moment beneath the night sky, looking back toward the glowing windows of the Bennet estate behind her, before turning finally toward her own home, waiting quietly in the darkness ahead. Winter settled over the county slowly, frost creeping across the fields each morning, the gardens at Ashgrove Hall entering their quiet dormant season under Arthur's careful attention. Eleanor's life had, by this point, settled into a comfortable rhythm, her business continuing to grow steadily, her friendship with Grace deepening into something genuinely valuable, her presence within the community no longer a curiosity but simply an accepted fact of local life. She had not spoken with Charles Bennet since the night of the autumn gathering, their paths crossing only occasionally and briefly along the boundary wall, each encounter marked by polite, distant nods rather than any real conversation. She found she preferred it that way, the tension between them settling into a manageable, if unresolved, equilibrium. It was Daniel who first alerted her to the situation that would change everything, arriving at Ashgrove Hall unannounced on a cold December afternoon, his expression carrying an unusual mixture of caution and barely contained curiosity. "I need to discuss something with you," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk in the study. "A business matter, though I suspect you'll find it has rather personal implications as well." Eleanor set down the papers she had been reviewing, giving him her full attention. "Go on." "I received an inquiry 2 days ago, through a mutual business contact, regarding a potential investment opportunity. A regional investment firm is facing significant financial difficulty, the result of a poorly structured development deal that fell through last year. They're searching quietly for new capital to avoid a much more public collapse." Daniel paused, watching her carefully. "The firm is Bennet Associates." Eleanor sat back slowly in her chair, the implications settling into place. "Charles's family firm." "Precisely. Edward Bennet founded it decades ago, and Charles has been working to expand its reach over the past several years, apparently taking on more aggressive projects than the firm's traditional conservative approach would normally allow. One of those projects, a large residential development 2 counties over, collapsed when the primary lender withdrew unexpectedly, leaving the firm exposed to significant losses." "How significant?" "Significant enough that without new investment within the next few months, they may be forced to sell off substantial assets, potentially including portions of their own estate, to cover the losses." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "The inquiry came to me because of my reputation for discretion in these matters, and because whoever is managing the search for investors clearly doesn't yet know that I represent you directly. They're looking for capital, Eleanor, and your business is in an excellent position to provide it, if you're interested." Eleanor sat with the information for a long moment, turning it over carefully in her mind, considering the strange, almost poetic symmetry of the situation unfolding before her. Months earlier, she had stood in that family's ballroom, humiliated in front of everyone she knew, dismissed as someone unworthy of their company. Now, quietly, without their knowledge, she held the potential to become the very thing standing between their family's continued prosperity and genuine financial collapse. "Do they know who the potential investor might be?" she asked. "Not yet. The inquiry came through general channels, seeking any interested parties. If you chose to pursue this, we could likely arrange the investment through a holding structure that would keep your identity concealed until the deal was finalized, if that's what you preferred." Elinor considered this option carefully, weighing the appeal of quiet, private power against something else stirring within her. A desire, perhaps, for the truth to eventually surface in exactly the right moment, on exactly her terms. "No," she said finally. "I don't want to hide behind anonymity on this one, Daniel. If I invest in Bennett Associates, I want them to know, eventually, precisely who came to their rescue." Daniel studied her for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I thought you might say that." Over the following weeks, Elinor worked closely with Daniel and her financial advisors to structure a careful, thorough review of Bennett Associates' financial situation, examining the firm's assets, liabilities, and the specific circumstances surrounding their failed development project. What she found painted a picture of a firm that remained fundamentally sound, but had been genuinely wounded by one significant miscalculation, largely attributable, based on internal documents Daniel was able to review, to decisions Charles himself had championed against his father's more cautious advice. The investment, if structured carefully, represented a genuinely sound opportunity, one that would provide Elinor's growing business portfolio with a meaningful stake in a respected regional firm, while offering Bennett Associates the capital infusion necessary to stabilize their position and avoid the more drastic measures that would otherwise become necessary. She proceeded methodically, careful and thorough exactly as she approached every significant business decision, ensuring the terms of the investment protected her interests fully, while genuinely offering the Bennett family a fair path back toward financial stability. She was not interested in punishing them through the deal, she realized as the negotiations progressed. She was interested, instead, in demonstrating, clearly and unmistakably, exactly the caliber of businesswoman they had so carelessly dismissed months earlier. The formal negotiations took place over several weeks, conducted primarily through Daniel and the Bennett family's own legal representation, with Elinor's identity kept confidential until the final stages, exactly as she had directed. She found the process oddly satisfying, reviewing detailed financial reports from the firm that had once mocked her, watching Edward Bennett's careful, professional responses to each negotiating point, aware that neither he nor his son yet realized who sat on the other side of the table. The reveal finally came on a cold January afternoon, during a formal meeting arranged at Daniel's office to finalize the investment terms. Elinor arrived early, dressed in a sharp, professional suit rather than evening wear, her expression calm and composed as she reviewed the final documents with Daniel one last time. "Are you certain about this approach?" Daniel asked, watching her carefully. "We could still finalize everything through the holding structure, keep your involvement private even after the deal closes." "I'm certain," Elinor said. "It's time." Edward and Charles Bennett arrived precisely on schedule, accompanied by their own solicitor, a tall, formal man who greeted Daniel with professional courtesy before the group settled around the conference table to review the final terms of the agreement. Elinor remained seated slightly apart, her presence unexplained, though she noticed Charles's gaze flicker toward her more than once, a faint, puzzled recognition beginning to form behind his eyes. Edward Bennett, focused entirely on the documents before him, did not immediately register her presence beyond a polite nod, his attention consumed by the careful review of terms that would determine his family firm's future stability. It was only when Daniel began the formal introduction of the investing party that the full weight of the situation settled visibly across both men's faces. "Gentlemen," Daniel said, his tone professional and measured, "I'd like to formally introduce the principal investor behind this agreement, Miss Elinor Hartley." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy across the room. Edward's expression shifted through a rapid sequence of emotions, surprise giving way to something that looked almost like reluctant admiration, while Charles simply stared, his face draining of color in a manner strikingly similar to what Lucy had described hearing about weeks earlier, when he first learned who had purchased Ashgrove Hall. "Miss Hartley," Edward said finally, recovering his composure with the practiced grace of a man accustomed to navigating difficult business situations. "I confess, this is entirely unexpected." "I imagine it is," Elinor said calmly, meeting his gaze steadily. "I hope it doesn't change your assessment of the terms we've negotiated. Everything remains exactly as outlined in the documents before you, structured to give your firm the stability it needs while representing a sound investment for my own business." Edward studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his careful expression. "The terms are more than fair, Miss Hartley, generous, even given the circumstances. I confess I'm curious why you chose to structure things this way, rather than simply pursuing a more advantageous position given our current difficulties." "Because I don't believe in profiting excessively from someone else's misfortune," Elinor said simply. "I believe in sound business, conducted fairly, that benefits everyone involved. Your firm has a solid foundation and a strong reputation. It simply needed capital, and perhaps a reminder that careful, measured decisions serve a business better than aggressive risks that outpace its actual resources." The pointed nature of her final comment was not lost on anyone in the room, and Elinor watched as Edward's gaze flicked briefly, sharply, toward his son, a silent, weighted acknowledgement passing between father and son that required no further words. Charles, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice notably subdued compared to the confident tone she remembered from the ballroom months earlier. "Miss Hartley, I think it's fair to say none of us anticipated this outcome, given our history." "No," Elinor agreed evenly. "I imagine you didn't. I want you to know," he continued, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to meet hers directly, "that I'm genuinely grateful for what you're doing here. Regardless of everything that happened before, this firm means a great deal to my family, and your investment will make a real difference for the people who work here, for the families who depend on it." Elinor studied him carefully, searching for any trace of the arrogance that had once colored his every interaction with her, finding instead something that looked, for the first time since she had known him, like genuine humility. "I didn't do this for you, Charles," she said honestly. "I did it because it made sound business sense, and because I believe your family firm, despite its recent difficulties, deserves the chance to recover properly. But I won't pretend there isn't a certain satisfaction in knowing that the woman you once dismissed so publicly is the reason your family's business survives this difficult chapter." The room fell quiet again, the weight of her words settling fully across everyone present. Edward Bennet, to his credit, met her gaze with something like respect rather than resentment, extending his hand across the table. "Whatever happened between you and my son," he said, "I want you to know that I, personally, am deeply grateful for your generosity and your business acumen. This firm bears my name, and I intend to ensure it honors the trust you've placed in it going forward." Elinor shook his hand firmly. "I look forward to seeing it thrive, Mr. Bennet." The formal signing proceeded smoothly from there, the terms finalized precisely as negotiated, the investment secured, Bennet Associates' immediate financial crisis effectively resolved. As the meeting concluded and the Bennet men prepared to leave, Charles lingered briefly near the door, waiting until his father had stepped out ahead of him before turning back toward Elinor one final time. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think you may be the most impressive person I've ever met, and I'm ashamed it took me this long to recognize it properly." Elinor regarded him steadily, allowing herself, finally, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Apology accepted, Charles, this time fully." He nodded once, a small, sincere gesture entirely unlike the dismissive arrogance she remembered from months earlier, before turning to follow his father out of the office. Daniel let out a low whistle once the door closed behind them, shaking his head slowly. I don't think I've ever witnessed anything quite like that in my entire career. Alina gathered the finalized documents carefully, feeling something settle deeply and permanently into place within her, a sense of closure she had not fully expected to experience so completely. Neither have I, Daniel, she said, a quiet smile lingering on her lips. Neither have I. Spring arrived slowly that year, the frost retreating from the fields around Ashgrove Hall in gradual stages. The gardens Arthur had tended so carefully through winter beginning to show the first signs of new growth. Alina spent her mornings walking the grounds, watching the estate come back to life around her, feeling a similar sense of renewal settling within her own life as the months following the investment agreement unfolded. News of her investment in Bennett Associates had, inevitably, spread through the local business community, though this time the story carried a different weight than the gossip that had followed her purchase of Ashgrove Hall months earlier. Where once she had been discussed as the humiliated woman who bought the estate next door out of spite, she was now spoken of as a shrewd, generous businesswoman who had quietly saved one of the region's most respected firms from collapse, expecting nothing but fair terms in return. Grace hosted a small gathering that spring specifically in Alina's honor, gathering together the growing circle of accomplished women who had come to respect and admire her over the preceding months, celebrating not only her business achievements, but the quiet grace with which she had handled every challenge thrown in her path since that difficult night at the ball. "You've become something of a legend around here," Grace told her during the gathering, raising a glass in her direction. "The woman who turned humiliation into an empire, right next door to the very people who tried to tear her down." Alina laughed, genuinely touched by the sentiment, though she waved away the more dramatic characterization. "It wasn't an empire, Grace. Just careful, patient work. Careful, patient work that happened to result in you owning a magnificent estate and holding a meaningful stake in the very firm that once employed the man who humiliated you," Grace countered with a knowing smile. "Call it what you like. The rest of us call it remarkable." The relationship between Alina and the Bennett family continued to evolve in the months that followed, settling into something neither of them could have predicted the night of the ball. Edward Bennett visited Ashgrove Hall on several occasions throughout the spring, genuinely interested in the restoration work Alina had completed, sharing stories about Constance Farrow that added depth and history to the home Alina now cherished. Margaret remained more reserved, though even she had softened considerably, occasionally sending over fresh flowers from the Bennett gardens as a quiet gesture of goodwill. Charles, surprisingly, became something of a regular presence as well, though their interactions carried an entirely different character than anything before. He approached her one afternoon in early spring, while she was working alongside Arthur in the newly planted rose garden, his manner notably humble compared to the arrogance she remembered so vividly from months earlier. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, standing awkwardly near the garden gate. "Business-related if you have a moment." Alina straightened, brushing soil from her gloves. "Go ahead." "I've been reconsidering my approach at the firm," he said. "Following everything that happened, I've had a lot of time to think about the decisions I made, the risks I pushed for against my father's advice. I'd like to build something more sustainable going forward, and I was hoping, given your stake in the company, that you might be willing to offer some guidance. Not as a favor," he added quickly, "as a genuine business consultation. I understand if you'd rather not, given everything between us." Alina studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his request against the memory of who he had once been, before deciding that people, given the right circumstances, were sometimes capable of genuine change. "I'd be glad to help," she said. "On one condition." "Anything." "You listen. Actually listen this time, rather than assuming your family's name gives you all the answers you need." Charles nodded, a small, rueful smile crossing his face. "I think I've learned that lesson rather thoroughly over the past several months." Their working relationship developed steadily from there, Alina offering careful, measured advice during regular meetings at the firm, watching with genuine satisfaction as Charles began implementing more sustainable, thoughtful strategies that reflected the lessons of his earlier failure. He proved, she found, to be a quick and genuinely capable student when freed from the arrogance that had once clouded his judgment. And slowly, month by month, Bennett Associates began recovering not just financially, but structurally, building a stronger, more resilient foundation than it had possessed even before the failed development deal that had nearly destroyed it. Their relationship remained strictly professional, respectful, but measured, neither of them attempting to erase the history that had brought them to this point, both instead choosing to build something new from the foundation of mutual respect that had slowly, carefully developed between them. Elinor found she genuinely valued their working relationship, appreciating the person Charles had become in the aftermath of his earlier cruelty, though she never forgot, and never allowed him to forget, exactly where that transformation had begun. By early summer, Ashgrove Hall had fully bloomed into the home Elinor had envisioned during those first quiet moments walking its halls months earlier. The gardens flourished under Arthur's careful attention, the restored rooms filled with warmth and life, the low stone wall separating her property from the Bennett estate no longer a symbol of division, but simply a familiar boundary between two households that had, against every expectation, found a way toward genuine mutual respect. She hosted her own gathering that summer, the first significant social event she had organized since moving into the estate, inviting a carefully curated mix of guests, business associates, close friends like Lucy and Grace, and notably the entire Bennett family, extending the invitation personally rather than through the formal channels that had governed their earlier interactions. The evening unfolded beautifully, warm summer air drifting through the open doors leading out to the newly restored terrace, laughter and conversation filling the halls that had once stood empty and neglected before Elinor's careful restoration brought them back to life. She moved through the gathering with easy confidence, greeting guests, overseeing every detail with the same careful attention she brought to every aspect of her life, feeling, for the first time since that painful night at the Bennett ball so many months earlier, a genuine, complete sense of belonging exactly where she stood. Edward Bennett found her during a quiet moment on the terrace, both of them watching the sun set slowly over the grounds that separated their two estates. "Constance would be proud, you know," he said quietly, "of what you've done with this place, of what you've built." "Thank you," Elinor said, genuinely moved by the sentiment. "That means a great deal to me." "I want you to know," Edward continued, "that I've thought often over these past months about that night at our ball. I wasn't present when it happened, but I heard about it soon enough. I should have addressed it more directly at the time, rather than allowing it to simply fade from conversation. I'm sorry it took circumstances like these for our families to find proper mutual respect." Elinor considered his words carefully before responding. "I appreciate that, Edward, but I think, in the end, everything unfolded exactly as it needed to. That night gave me the push I needed to pursue something I might otherwise have hesitated over. I don't know that I would change any of it, difficult as it was at the time." Edward smiled, raising his glass slightly toward her in a small, private toast. "To unexpected outcomes, then." "To unexpected outcomes," Elinor agreed, touching her glass lightly against his. Later that evening, as the gathering began winding down and guests started making their departures, Elinor found herself standing alone near the low stone wall, looking out across the darkening grounds toward the Bennett estate glowing warmly in the distance. Charles approached quietly, standing a respectful distance away, both of them silent for a long moment as they took in the peaceful summer evening settling around them. "Thank you for the invitation tonight," he said finally. "It means more than you probably realize." "You're welcome," Elinor said simply. "I think about that night at the ball often," he admitted, his voice carrying genuine reflection rather than any lingering defensiveness. "I was a different person then. Careless, arrogant, certain that the things I'd been given, my family's name, our estate, our reputation, meant I was somehow better than the people around me. You proved, more thoroughly than anyone ever has, exactly how wrong I was." Elinor turned to look at him directly, studying the genuine humility now present in his expression, so different from the cruel amusement she remembered from that night months earlier. We all make mistakes, Charles. What matters is what we choose to do afterward. I hope I've shown you that I've chosen differently, he said quietly. You have, Elinor said, and meant it fully. I'm genuinely glad to call you a good neighbor now, rather than simply a cautionary tale. Charles laughed softly at that, a genuine, unguarded sound. I suppose I deserve that. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the last light fade from the summer sky, the low stone wall between their two estates no longer feeling like a boundary at all, but simply a quiet, familiar line marking two lives that had, against every expectation, found their way toward mutual respect and genuine friendship. As the final guests departed and the house grew quiet around her, Elinor climbed the stairs to her bedroom, pausing at the window that looked out toward the Bennet estate in the distance, its lights glowing softly against the darkening sky. She thought of the woman she had been that night at the ball, humiliated and devastated, walking out through those grand doors uncertain of anything except her own determination not to be broken by cruelty she had done nothing to deserve. She thought of everything that had followed, the careful, determined work of building something entirely her own, the risk she had taken pursuing Ashgrove Hall, the satisfaction of watching Charles Bennet's confident smile falter the first time he understood exactly who she had become. She thought of the friendships she had built along the way, of Grace and Lucy, of Daniel's steady, reliable support, of Edward's genuine respect, and even, unexpectedly, of Charles's sincere transformation. Most of all, she thought of her mother, and the quiet lesson she had carried with her throughout every difficult moment of the past year. Build something so carefully that no one can ever take it from you again. She had done exactly that. Standing in the quiet darkness of her bedroom, looking out over the estate that was entirely, permanently her own, Elinor Hartley finally allowed herself to feel something she had not fully permitted since that painful night months earlier. Complete, unshakable peace. Whatever came next, whatever challenges the future might bring, she knew now with absolute certainty exactly what she was capable of building from even the most painful beginnings. And that knowledge, more valuable than any estate or investment, would remain with her for the rest of her life. She closed the curtains slowly, the soft glow of the Bennet estate disappearing behind them, and turned toward the quiet comfort of the home she had built entirely on her own terms, ready, at last, for whatever came next.